weird not having anybody come on you.
Hey guys, Jim here. Welcome in once again. Let's talk about options. Let's talk about the different aspects that we look at when we're choosing between buying certain knives over other ones. Now, if you go back into more classic everyday EDC knives, just having a simple thumb stud opener is great. You've got options for slow rolling the blade, you can thumb flick the blade, and you can reverse flick the blade. And this, to this day, is still one of my favorite EDC knives. However, sometimes you just want to sit there and play with your knife. Having multiple methods of deployment, while it's a relatively new thing, isn't something that you can't have with a lot of other knives. As I just showed you here with the thumb stud opener, I can open this in a multitude of ways. But seeing something like the EMP EDC Nimble, I can reverse flick it, I can slow roll it, I can thumb flick it, I can use the flipper tab, or, and I'm really bad at this, I can front flip it if I were good at front flipping. This is the knife that really opened up my eyes to this whole new world of having all of these various methods of deployment. That blade window, the placement of it, the way that it's been cut, everything just makes this a hell of a lot more fun. And let's be practical here. There's knives that you're going to buy that you're just going to have as a user or an EDC knife that has to fit a utilitarian purpose. It's got to have a specific blade shape, made out of a certain blade steel, ground a certain way, have a certain balance in the hand, have certain ergonomics. And if it fits all of those requirements within the price that you're willing to pay in a design that you find attractive, that's probably going to be the best knife for you. But as knife collectors, we like to have a whole lot of different options. So you've got a whole lot of different knives in your collection. So it would stand to reason that you might want a whole lot of options in just one knife. The winter blade factor is another one that I absolutely love for this reason. Because right back here, you've got this flipper bar, which I love flipping it with the flipper bar. But there are a lot of people that say, I'm not really crazy about that. I'm going to put the backspacer in there that blocks that feature because I prefer to finger flick it. Okay, well, you've got that option as well. I can slow roll it. I can thumb flick it. I can do anything that I want to with this knife. And it's fidget friendly is the term that we've really come to know and hear a lot over the past 3 or 4 years. Again, it doesn't make the knife better. It doesn't make it more useful. It just makes it more fun because at the end of the day, most guys, we're like large children. We like things that glow in the dark. We like to hear that mechanical sound of that steel blade hitting the blade stop and you hear that lockup. We love to feel that detent break. And a knife like this, which is the Brian Brown Jaeger M, this is available with or without a flipper tab. So if somebody just wants to reverse flick, they're just going to buy the non-flipper. I will never buy the non-flipper versions. I always want the flipper variants because I like to have both options. Not just to satisfy the different ways I can do it, but I really appreciate how it changes the feel of the detent. If I'm finger flicking it, it feels one way. But if I'm applying pressure to that flipper tab, I feel exactly when that detent breaks, and it gives me a whole completely different experience than if I were finger flicking it. So there's something about that that I really, really appreciate. It's hard to justify to people that aren't really that much into knives. They're just kind of starting to get into it. They're like, well, I really don't care how it opens. It's a side folding knife. As long as I have some way of manipulating it to where it opens, I'm fine with that. But it's as you grow in this hobby and the more knives that you acquire and the different styles and tastes and shapes and profiles and materials and all the different boxes that we check as we buy all these different knives, I think that this is the next evolution in that same thing. I want variety in my collection. I want a variety of styles and materials and blade shapes and blade steels and handle materials and inlays. And now I'm kind of at the point where I want a lot of variety in the way that it opens, in the way that I can use it. And there are certain knives that I really only do one way or the other. With the EMP EDC Nimble, I still, because of the size and shape of this knife and the way that it fits in my hand when I first pull it out of the pocket, for me, I prefer that reverse finger flick. Yes, I can flip it with the flipper tab every bit as easily, but it just somehow feels more secure in my hand with that reverse finger flick. And this was the knife that really got me into this whole thing. I never really cared all that much before. As a matter of fact, I've always been a fan of just having a flipper tab, just being a flipper guy. That's always been my preference. If somebody said, hey, do you want thumb studs or a thumb disc or a spidey hole or a flipper tab, it would always be, I want a flipper tab. And now this knife changed the way that I kind of play and fidget with my knives a little bit. And I think it's actually got me into playing with them a little bit more. Now, I don't mean playing as in being careless in some way. I don't want somebody to view this and go, oh, he's saying that that knives are toys and you should just sit there and play with them. You know, it's like saying when you get a new gun, oh, I've got a new toy, I'm going to go play with this at the range. We're not downplaying the fact that it's a dangerous weapon that can injure or kill somebody, and we're not making light of that. It's just that, well, you get the same excitement level as a kid that gets a new toy, and you are going to go play with it at the range. Yes, you're going to go shoot it. You're doing something purposeful in you're training or something, but it's an enjoyable, fun experience for you, so it's just very easy to say playing with it. So when I say that this has opened my eyes to wanting to play with my knives more often, I don't mean be reckless and careless and stupid with them. I just mean there'll be times that I'll walk up here into my studio where I keep all of my knives, and there are times that I'll just simply walk up to my knife case, open it up, and pull a knife out and just play with it, just fidget with it. I'm not cutting anything. I'm not leaving the house, so I'm not grabbing my knife for the day to stick in my pocket. I just felt the need, because there are certain knives that pull at you like that, especially when you first get them and you're in that honeymoon phase, that I just want to play with it. I want to go upstairs and I want to grab one of my factors, and I just want to feel that clickety clack and hear that ting as I open and close it. There's something satisfying about that. So anyway, that's kind of where this video is coming from. It's not anything particularly serious. It's just talking about a few of the different knives that give us a multitude of options in which we can open the blade, and maybe there's different options for how you can interface with the lock and things like that. It's just something that I think that we're broadening our horizons right now in the industry, and we're seeing so many more different ways to enjoy our knives. There are always going to be those people that the only enjoyment they get out of a knife is taking their knife outside and doing outdoorsy shit and splitting wood and doing shit like that. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And then there are some people that get all 100% of their enjoyment in their knife collecting by just buying something that they find attractive and putting it in a display case and looking at it like a piece of art. Well, there's nothing wrong with that either, because they're getting the appreciation for the item that they paid for, that they were expecting to get out of it. And for some of us, it's going to be an EDC item that's always with us. And if there's something that needs to be cut or anything like that, we've got something with us at all times. And we may just like to have the option of kind of playing with it a little bit, feeling that detent, feeling the smoothness of the action. And that's really what this is all about. So let me know down below, what's your favorite method? Do you prefer flipper only? Do you prefer thumb studs, thumb discs? Do you prefer slip joints? That's a whole nother segment, and there's a great enjoyment out of feeling that mechanical action of opening up and closing a slip joint. Or do you prefer something that has a lot of different methods of operation? And I kind of think that I'm falling more into the latter. And most of the knives that even I have designed that I have coming out in the next year or two, still almost all of those are flipper only variations. And I'm stopping myself and I'm looking at my designs going, is there room on this blade, on those flats somewhere that doesn't disrupt the flow of the overall design, that doesn't mess with where the grinds are laid, and it doesn't require me to cut into the frame and do anything weird? Is there room in there for me to fit a milled groove, a fuller, a blade window, or a notch or something, or put a thumb stud on it where people have those different options? Because I think I might even want some of those options in a few of those knives. You know, I'm second guessing my Hellraiser folder at this point, thinking it would be kind of cool to have multiple ways to deploy that blade instead of just the flipper that I designed onto it. So maybe I'll change that. I really don't know. So sound off down below. What's your preferred method of opening and closing a knife? Are you a Sebenza guy and you just want to slow roll it, or the occasional flick off of the thumb stud? Do you prefer flippers? What about the action excites you? Do you like the feeling of that lightning fast opening or that smooth closing? Is it the way that you're interacting with it, with either the fingernail on your middle finger or your thumb, or flipper tab under your index finger? What is it that really makes you go, I have to have that type of deployment? That's the one I'm going to choose. Because again, there are knives like the Jaeger where you have that option. You can have a flipper tab or no flipper tab. Some knives that you can have thumb studs or no thumb studs. The VBR is a great example. So if you buy a VBR, Mark 1, Mark 2, they have no thumb studs. The third variation is where the thumb studs came into play, and that gave people a little bit of an option as to how they play with that knife. Or how I should say how they interact with that knife. Maybe that's better to use than the word play. But either way, I'd love to hear from you guys, and people that choose, I want to have multiple deployment. Which ones are your favorite? Which ones have you found that it's just as easy to use the flipper tab as it is the front flipper and the blade window? Because there may be knives out there that would interest me that I haven't even seen yet that maybe you guys have in your collection. Let's take a look up close at a few of these and fondle them and play with them and interact with them, if that's the way you prefer me to say it, and see how we all feel about these different options that we're now being given. Sometimes we just want options, don't we? And for a long time, my strongest preference has been a flipper-only knife, which is why I designed the Kaladin the way that I did. However, as I'm now making my way into the Kaladin V2, the second run, I'm already deciding how I'm designing the third variation. Now, the third one is going to be a sheep's foot blade. So the blade isn't going to start dropping here. It's going to come straight out, and then it's going to do a curve right at the end with the same edge profile. So I'm thinking, well, if I make the blade just a little bit taller and I add a nice blade window in there, then we can have something where we can reverse flick. And then I think, well, no, maybe a fuller is going to work out better, but I still want to have my top swedge on there, and that's going to be interruptive to the way that that's going to be ground. So it's hard for me to decide exactly which way I want to go, because where you're holding the knife, you really need that to be down there. You don't want it to be up here. You want it to be down here to more easily access it. So I've got to run a nice long fuller groove down the length of the blade so that you have that option. And I just don't know that I want to change up the design that much in order to add that additional option of being able to reverse finger flick it. And I'm wondering, is it that big enough of a deal for most people that I need to add that I need to put that kind of effort into it? And then I pick up some of my other flipper-only knives that I enjoy out of my collection. My Anton knives, Angel's Finger Boudica here is still I think the most amazing action I've ever had in any knife. It is glass smooth. It's a super fast action, a crisp and strong detent. Strength to the point where it's pretty much impossible to use that blade window to flick it. That's just not something that you can really do easily, or for some people even at all. But I'm thoroughly happy with it just being a flipper. I love that feeling of that detent breaking. I love that I can preload on that flipper tab almost as hard as I want and control when it breaks. But it would be nice to have that option, especially that it has that blade window built in, so you'd think it would be a little bit easier to reverse flick. Now, when I was mentioning the VBR earlier, here is the latest iteration of the VBR that adds the thumb studs to it. So it's always been a flipper-only knife, and I've been perfectly happy with that. But now, there have been times that I do really enjoy having the thumb studs on there. It doesn't completely change the knife for me, and I guess you can reverse flick it. It's just not quite as easy. But I still enjoy it for its ergonomics over everything else, and I love the blade grind on there. And 9 times out of 10, when I pick this up, I'm going to be flipping it with the flipper tab, because that's just what works best for me on this knife. On a knife like the Grant Gripper, there's a ton of options. So you've got a flipper tab, you've got a front flipper, you've got a very large blade window, and you have a fuller groove. So you can even access it all the way down there. And the detent was tuned just right for this, that every different method has a satisfying deployment. And for those that have bought this and just they don't like flippers all that much, you don't have a big giant flipper tab sticking out, distracting away from the design, and you've got all of these different ways that you can open the knife if you want to. And I wonder that sometimes too, how restrictive it is when you design a knife with only one way or another of deploying it. If it's a flipper-only knife, how many people are out there going, I think the knife is gorgeous and I know it's well made, but I just don't like flippers, so that's not going to work for me. I really want to have the option to reverse flick it or thumb flick it or slow roll it. I want all of these different things. So I'm going to continue looking at other knives that will give me that. And I don't know how many of those people are really out there. I don't know if they're even really all that vocal. I can't recall anybody saying, yeah, I passed up on this knife because it's a flipper only. Well, when 90% of the time what you're doing is flipping it anyway, who cares? Okay, let's see if that sounds a little bit better now that I actually have a microphone plugged in. Oh my God, I can't even believe that shit. Anyway, so as I continue on, instead of re-recording like I really should be doing, we'll talk about some other knives that only have one method of deployment, but it's one of the newer methods. My Devo Stout here is a great example of that. Until this knife, I really would have never looked at a knife that only had a blade window, that I feel the best way to deploy it is doing the reverse flick. I would have wanted to have a flipper tab, or I would have wanted to have thumb studs or some other options. But I've fallen in love with this knife over almost, I guess, about 8 months, 9 months that I've had it, to the point where it's one of my most carried knives. And I love the way that it deploys. I love feeling that. Would it be better for me if it also had a flipper tab? Yes. But being only a flickable blade, is that a deal killer? Obviously not. It's sitting here in my collection. So there are definitely going to be those knives that you're going to have a strong preference in what you're buying, but you're also going to have a strong preference once you receive it with how you open it. Here's a great example. I absolutely love this knife. However, being a person that prefers using a flipper tab, the lamella is a little bit uncomfortable if you're just using the flipper tab. It's small, it's pointy, it's very, very far forward because of the way that this curves to match the shape of the blade. You end up needing to put this right into your hand to support it to keep it from sliding down like this. So it's not like holding, well, anything else. If I'm holding the VBR, you see where it's resting in my hand and the flipper tab is right there and very easy to access. When I put this knife where I need to have the leverage, the flipper tab is really far forward, and having that sharp edge on there really is not the most comfortable. So for this one, a lot of times I'll use the thumb studs, or I'll reverse flick off of that very long fuller that they've cut into there. So I can still enjoy this knife for all of the beauty and the action and everything else that satisfies me about it, because it's not a flipper only. If this were a flipper only, I wouldn't be carrying it as much because it's just such a long reach, and it ends up feeling a bit uncomfortable to access the flipper tab. So by having these other options, this makes this a more viable option for me to carry all the time and to enjoy to the fullest. Yeah, man, if that was a flipper only, I might not have actually even kept it. It does a little number on your finger there. I don't know if it's really showing up at all. But you could see a little bit there where it's kind of dug in and tore into the skin a little bit. That's not very fun. And again, going back to the Jaeger M, they make that version without the flipper tab for those that just prefer to flick. And while I do, probably 60% of the time, flick this knife, my main satisfaction when feeling the action on this knife really does come from flipping it and pushing up against that detent. There's something about the way it feels. It's a true dual personality. It's a completely different experience, flipping it over flicking it. And at the end of the day, really, this hobby is about enjoyment on some level. And a lot of the enjoyment for me is going to be in the action, in opening and closing it and kind of feeling the engineering and the execution that went into this particular design. And I still have to thank John Rusk over at EMP EDC, because this is the knife that really converted me. I really, really love this knife and all of the other variations that I own of it, because it gives me all of those different opportunities. And until I got this knife in my hand, I would say easily 90% of my collection were flipper-only knives, because I just always loved flippers. And I assumed that on this one I would be using the flipper tab more often than I do. But because of the way that it fits in my hand, it puts that blade window right where my middle finger is automatically. So I tend to just go ahead and reverse flick it, and it feels really good when I do that. And it also puts my hand right in that position where my index finger goes into the choil, just from the way I'm naturally holding it to do that flick. So while there's a multitude of options out there and you could choose one or the other, I think I'm really, really beginning to appreciate having the multitude of options in one knife. I'm always going to enjoy using the flipper bar on the Factor. But if I'm being honest, I probably reverse flick it more than anything when I'm actually pulling it out to use it. If I'm pulling it out because I want to admire it and I want to play with it, I'm doing both. And maybe that's just because I'm consciously thinking about it. I'm like, oh, let me feel it this way and let me feel it this way. But when I'm actually pulling it out of my pocket because I want to cut something, I found that it falls naturally in my hand in this position, and it's faster and easier for me to reverse flick it. And I'm really glad that I have those options. I don't even think that I noticed before how difficult it is to use the blade window on the Boudica. And it's because of the very sharp detent that this has. There are even times that it's a little bit hard to flip it with the flipper tab because it is such a strong, sharp detent. But look at the way that closes. Like friggin' butter. It is so fucking smooth. But I think today might be the first time I've noticed that I really can't finger flick it. And it doesn't matter to me because that's not how I enjoy using that knife anyway. With the gripper, I tend to do pretty much everything with this. Now, I know when I use the flipper tab a lot, like several times in a row, I feel my fingers going right into here. They're not sharp edges, but they're noticeable points. So I will tend to reverse flick it a lot more often than I will anything else. And while the blade window is fine the way it is, I'm really glad that the fuller is there because that allows me, in how I hold this particular knife, the size that it is, my finger lands further down. I don't like being that close to the pivot on this particular knife when I'm deploying the blade. So again, the experience with this knife has been so much better simply because it has all of those different options for me built into just one knife. I'm really happy with that. There are some that one single deployment method is totally fine, and I'm perfectly happy, and I don't really feel the need for any additional ones. I think maybe on the Devo, it would be a nice thing to have as an option, but it's never going to prevent me from enjoying that knife the way that it is. With the VBR, it's kind of backwards for me. It's nice, I guess, to have the thumb studs on there, but for me, it was completely senseless. It wasn't necessary. I like having the option, and every now and then I will use the thumb studs, but this one, the way that it's set up, the way that it fits my hand, I always want to use the flipper tab. And that's what makes me second guess myself on what I'm going to do for the Kaladin in the sheep's foot. Do I really need to offer the additional way of deploying the blade? I don't know that it's necessary. I don't know that it's going to satisfy that many more diverse people just to add that, just to have to sit down and spend hours reconfiguring the blade, reconfiguring the geometry between the detent, the blade stop, and the pivot, just so that, and on this knife, I feel that it really needs to be right about there. Not all the way up here, but down there. So I've got to make that where that detent break is just perfect for this, and also still for the flipper tab. Because this will always and forever be a flipper knife. That's the way I designed it. When I designed the Hellfire, and this is coming at some point soon, I've had to give up on Best Tech, unfortunately, because of zero communication on this particular model after they made the prototype. But I am going forward with Tuya Knife and making this. The fuller wasn't there as an additional means of opening. It was there because it worked with the design and it accentuated the shape of the spine of this massive blade. However, it was a nice surprise to see that I can reverse flick that massive blade off of that fuller. So now, people could choose if they want to use the flipper tab or if they want to reverse flick it. Now, it doesn't have a very sharply defined fuller, and that may change a little bit when we go into production. And it is a very large, heavy blade, so you've got to kind of put a little bit into it in order to get it to flick out that way. But that one more or less accidentally has the multiple ways of deploying it. So that's my thoughts. That's where I've kind of landed. I am so thankful still for experiencing the Nimble and getting that enjoyment that I didn't know that I was missing. And maybe you're in the same position. Maybe you're watching this going, what the hell is he going on about? I'm perfectly happy with my flipper knives or my thumbstud knives or whatever method of deployment that you currently collect the most of. Why is it such a big deal? It's not a big deal. It's just being able to enjoy it just a little bit more for different reasons in different moods. I think it's a nice option. And I hope to see many, many more companies and makers taking that into consideration, going, hey, there's a lot of different kind of people out there that like to open their knives a lot of different ways for a lot of different reasons. Let's give them as many options as we can. That's just the way I look at it. All right, guys, that's it for me for now. I'll see you on the next video.